Hello friends, 5th June 2024 at 10:52 a.m., a Starliner spacecraft was launched in America. It was carrying two experienced astronauts from NASA, Commander Barry E. Wilmore and pilot Suni. They were going on a small trip to the International Space Station. The spacecraft they were traveling in, Starliner, is a bit special. It was built by a private company, the same company that makes aeroplanes, and recently many of those aeroplanes crashed. This Starliner spacecraft is still in the developing stage, and this particular mission was the last step to test the capabilities of the Boeing Starliner. That's why this mission was literally named Boeing Crew Flight Test. The next day, after 27 hours at 1:34 p.m., the spacecraft begins docking at the International Space Station. It was a successful docking, and after some time, both the astronauts happily enter the space station. Look at this video. Pilot Sunita Williams was so excited while entering. This successful docking meant that Boeing became the world's second private company to make and fly a human's orbital spacecraft. Before this, only SpaceX had done this. To date, only 3 countries have been able to do this: Russia, the USA, and China. But the celebration for this good news could not last long. This Starliner mission was supposed to last only 8 days. These astronauts had to return to Earth after 8 days. But today, even after 3 months, both these astronauts are stuck in space. There are many problems with this spacecraft, because of which it cannot be used again. According to NASA, these astronauts will remain there for 8 months. How did this failure happen? How much can we blame Boeing? Let's understand this situation in this video. Before starting the video, it is important to clear one thing here, that though both of these astronauts are stuck in space, they are not in any kind of danger. The International Space Station is more than 350 feet long end to end. It can accommodate many people. The living and working space on the ISS is bigger than a 6-bedroom house. There's space for 6 people to sleep on the ISS. There's enough food, water, clothes, and oxygen supply system. There are 2 bathrooms, a gym, and a 360-degree view bay window. Although it is not a luxury hotel, it is a good place to stay comfortably and survive. The ISS has its own oxygen-generating system, which generates oxygen through the electrolysis of water. It also recycles oxygen. When we exhale, we release a high quantity of carbon dioxide, as well as oxygen to some extent. So, being able to react that oxygen, recovering it, and using it again, it can do that. Similarly, there is an excellent recycling system for water too. Urine is recycled into drinking water. Apart from this, the water recycling system can also capture all traces of moisture that is released as breath or sweat. And in terms of food, the ISS carries food reserve for 6 months. And in every 5 to 6 months, the crew members on the ISS keep rotating. Right now, the crew members of Expedition 71 are in the ISS. The video you saw earlier, in which Sunita Williams was excitedly entering the ISS, in that video, you can see other astronauts. They are a part of the Expedition 71 and were already living in the ISS. These 4 astronauts are from NASA: Matthew Dominic, Mike Barat, Jeanette Epps, and Tracy C. Dyson. And 3 astronauts from the Russian space agency Roscosmos: Oleg Kononenko, Nikolai Chub, and Alexander Grabenkin. Typically, there are 6 to 7 people on these expeditions. And this number, Expedition 71, indicates that this is the 71st team of crew members that have gone to the ISS on rotation. These expeditions have been going on for 24 years. In the year 2000, when the space station was first launched. Since then, the ISS hasn't been left empty for extended periods of time. The ISS hasn't been left empty for extended periods of time. Someone or the other has lived in it. The Expedition 71 will end on 24th September 2024, and these astronauts present in the ISS will return to Earth, and they will replace crew members of Expedition 72, and they can bring more food for these 2 astronauts. For now, NASA has said that Barry and Sunita, these 2 astronauts, are now parts of Expeditions 71 and 72, and they are now conducting research and experiments with the other astronauts. It's not like these 2 astronauts are stuck in space and are getting bored, or do you answer? And they are now conducting research and experiments with the other astronauts. It's not like these 2 astronauts are stuck in space and are getting bored with nothing else to do. Expedition 71 is currently researching space botany, How flowers can be grown in space. On space-caused fluid shifts. On algae-based life support system ASA, well as neurodegenerative disease and therapies are being researched at the IST. Both Barry Wilmore and Sunita Williams are highly experienced astronauts. Barry is 61 years old. He had already spent 178 days in space before this mission. Sunita Williams is an Indian-origin astronaut like Kalpana Chawla, although she was born in America. She is 58 years old, and before this mission, she has been in space for 322 days. Before this, she was a part of the expeditions 14, 15, 32, and 33. She was also the commander of Expedition 33, so you can see how experienced she is. So, overall, these two astronauts should not have any problem because they'll have food, water, and oxygen. Clothes were a little problematic because they were carrying clothes for only 8 days. They weren't carrying many things. But to solve this, NASA sent a shipment of their personal belongings on 6th August. So this was about the astronauts. But now let's talk about the problematic part. This Starliner spacecraft, Boeing Starliner spacecraft, is an orbital spacecraft. Its name is Cruise Space Transportation 100 Starliner. Also, Quan as CST-100 Spaceliner. After SpaceX, Boeing is the only private company that has been able to launch an orbital spacecraft to the ISS. Now, what does an orbital spacecraft mean? Orbital spacecraft is a spacecraft that are launched at such high velocities and then orbit around the Earth. It requires a speed of more than 28,000 kilometers per hour. On the other hand, suborbital spacecrafts reach the edge of space, but they cannot reach high enough to orbit Earth. They reach the orbit for a while, experience a little weightlessness, and then they come back down. The typical velocity of a suborbital spacecraft is less than 7,000 kilometers per hour. Clearly, building an orbital spacecraft is much more difficult than building a suborbital spacecraft, especially an orbital spacecraft that can facilitate humans' travel. Apart from the private companies SpaceX and Boeing, only 3 countries which have been able to make a human orbital spacecraft: China, Russia, and the USA, and India is trying. Our Gaganyaan mission will aim at this, sending humans to space in an orbital spacecraft. The first orbital test flight will be in December this year, although it will be an uncrewed flight. That is, there won't be humans in it. For the first test, they will seat a humanoid named Vyomitra. Basically, they will test the spacecraft using this doll. Because if we start by sending humans, and if a problem arises, it can be devastating. If we come back to NASA, they started their commercial crew program in 2011, according to which they can collaborate with private companies. Many companies bid for this program, including Blue Origin, Sierra Nevada, and in 2014, SpaceX and Boeing were selected for this program. The first SpaceX Crew 1 flight was launched in November 2020, and it was a success. This was their spacecraft named Crew Dragon. It looks very similar to Boeing's Starliner spacecraft, which looks like this. The crew module can seat 7 people. There is a window and a side hatch. You can see its interiors too. It shows a 5-person crew setup. The noteworthy elements are its thrusters. These help the spacecraft fly and move in different directions. These thrusters became the root of the problem, due to which these astronauts are stuck in space right now. The first launch date for Starliner CST was set to 6th May 2024. The launch of 5th June was actually planned for 6th May, but on 6th May, only 2 hours before the launch, the countdown was stopped due to a faulty pressure valve. The Atlas V rocket, to which this spacecraft is attached, had a faulty pressure valve. Then on 1st June, another attempt was made, but it was cancelled again just 4 minutes before the launch. This time, instead of a human, a computer abort system was the one to cancel it. And then on 5th June, you'll find it hard to believe that before this scheduled launch, Boeing and NASA's engineers were trying to manage a helium leak. Helium is the main gas which runs the propulsion system and fires the spacecraft's thrusters. When this spacecraft attaches to the International Space Station and docks in it, bringing it to the exact line, docking, undocking, these are done by the thrusters. And to operate these thrusters, helium is needed. NASA and Boeing engineers said that there was a helium leak due to a defective seal. But this leak was not a big deal. It was manageable and wasn't supposed to cause a big problem. This is why the launch was postponed once again, but a few hours after the launch, 2 more leaks were discovered. When Starliner researched the space station, they discover a 4th helium leak. After 4 leaks, the commercial crew program manager of Boeing finally admitted that they don't know what is the problem and that they need to first understand the root cause. This is not an isolated error. This is a major systematic problem. Apart from this, another problem arose hours before the docking of the Starliner. It was found that 5 out of the 28 thrusters on the Starliner were not working properly. Seeing this happen, spacecraft commander Barry Wilmore had to manually control the spacecraft. Working with the engineers on the ground, he reset the thrusters and fired them again. 4 out of 5 thrusters start working again, and so the Starliner successfully docked at the ISS. Steve Stitch, the commercial crew program manager at NASA, says that this failure was due to a data issue. It had nothing to do with this hardware of the thruster. But because of all these problems, NASA had to face several questions. Could the astronauts rely on the Starliner spacecraft to return to Earth, considering the numerous leaks and thrusters not working properly? After June 6, NASA and Boeing conducted some hot fire tests to check these thrusters. In these tests, they noticed that these thrusters were overheating, and this is why they weren't working properly. They found that due to direct sunlight exposure on the capsule's manual control system, there was substantial overheating. When these thrusters were tested again, without sunlight, they were found to be operating normally. But overall, the engineers weren't sure whether the overheating problem would recur when the Starliner returns. Overall, this is why it was decided that the Starliner would return to Earth without the astronauts, and for now those astronauts would remain in the space station. Overall, this is good news that NASA prioritized safety. Otherwise, everyone was reminded of the 2003 Challenger disaster when Kalpana Chawla was returning to Earth and her spacecraft exploded. Here, NASA has decided to bring Sunita Williams and Barry Wilmore back to Earth using SpaceX's Crew Dragon spacecraft. In February 2025, when SpaceX's Crew 9 mission will go to the ISS, in that mission, instead of 4 astronauts, only 2 will be sent, so that these 2 astronauts can return with it. But because this can be possible only in February next year, so in total, these 2 astronauts will spend almost 9 months in space. NASA's Steve Stitch calls Starliner a very capable spacecraft. He believes that it is not a bad spacecraft. But the 2 Starliner missions of before this, when it was tested without a crew, without humans, one of those tests had failed. The first Boeing Starliner mission was held on 20th December 2019, known as the Orbital Flight Test. There weren't any humans in it, rather, it carried the doll Rosie the Rocketeer, similar to the doll that would be carried by the Gaganyaan in a few months. The purpose of this mission was to remain in space for 8 days, dock at the International Space Station, and to return to Earth. But this mission was aborted just 2 days later. Starliner could not dock at the International Space Station. And why could it not? NASA and Boeing formed a joint review team to investigate this, and this team gave about 80 recommendations to NASA and Boeing to solve this problem. Once again, the reason behind this was that Starliner's thrusters could not fire on time, and so it could not reach the right orbit. The reason behind this was found to be the computer system's miscalibration of timing. Steve Stitch had then said that NASA could not provide sufficient oversight to Boeing, because of which there were these software problems. The second test was conducted on 19th May 2022. Boeing Orbital Flight Test 2, and this time it was successful. Roy's the Rocketeer actually reached the ISS, but even in that test, these were some glitches. Some thrusters weren't operating properly, the same problem as this year's launch. Interestingly, when NASA awarded the contracts to Boeing and SpaceX in 2014, the worth of SpaceX's contract was around $2.6 billion, and Boeing's contract was worth $4.2 billion. But today, SpaceX has left Boeing so far behind that it is soon going to attempt one of the most riskiest missions, the world's first private spacewalk by an astronaut, a 20-minute spacewalk in which astronauts will take a walk outside the spacecraft. But Boeing's problems are not limited to space. Even as an airline sovereign, Boeing has been subjected to criticism for the past few years. This is caused by Boeing's new 737 MAX commercial airplane and its deadly failures. A Boeing 737 MAX of the Alaska Airlines took off for a normal flight from Portland, USA to Ontario. As soon as the plane reached an altitude of 16,000 feet, a door of the plane completely broke apart. This caused a huge hole and led to rapid decompression. People's phones, laptops, and everything that was light not secured flew out of the plane. Thankfully, since the passengers were wearing seatbelts, no passenger fell out of the plane. But a few days later, during the Federal Aviation Administration's investigation, the cause was discovered to be loose hardware. The bolts in the door needed additional tightening. Alaska Airlines and United Airlines grounded all their 737 MAX airplanes. And in their investigations, it was found that there were loose parts in many Boeing airplanes. Before this, in 2018, there was a faulty sensor in their plane, due to which Lion Air Flight 610 crashed in Indonesia shortly after the takeoff. All passengers and crew members of the flight were killed. After that, in 2019, a similar incident happened with the Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. The plane crashed and all passengers were killed. It was revealed that the software installed by Boeing in the plane was a problematic software. In some cases, it took away the control from the pilots. The plane crashed due to the glitchy software.